One of the things that happens when we've got a problem or there's a situation going on, whether it's you, whether it's a client, or whether it's an organization, the way in which we think about the problem, in other words, how we define it, how we pack it in and look at it as a problem, its frame of reference is absolutely critical in terms of determining how we're going to figure out what to do with it, obviously. But here's the thing, you're old enough now, you've experienced enough problem solving, you've been through enough stuff. If you're a manager, you've got the experience. We start to try and figure out and solve the problem before we actually check what the real problem really is. And one of the biggest wastes of time, and yet places where I have to spend the most time, is with people who say, I have a problem, and it's this, and what I want to do about it is that. In other words, they decide what the solution set for the problem is before they've actually checked out the nature of the problem itself. What I call it is that it's the presumed solution set that accompanies the problem frame. And this is very important when we're talking about corporate work. It's very important in business, and it's also important in terms of how you go through your life. Because if you keep identifying things as being problems, but you misidentify what the problem is and mistake what the solutions are, you're going to spend an awful lot of time going around trying stuff out that doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because it's not actually the solution to what your real problem is. Hope that makes sense. We have to find out what the actual issue is rather than what you presume. Now, we've talked before about this in other places, about thinking that we're thinking. And, we assume that because we are adults and because we are somewhat rational and because we sometimes get things right, that we will automatically be able to identify accurately what the actual problem is and what its source is. But this is not true. It's an assumption that we make. It doesn't matter whether it's me or someone else, a client, people that I work with. You don't get a pass on having to check what's actually going on. See, you got to figure out the frame of reference in such a way that not only can something be done, but that the problem is solvable. You've done this, you've heard this before. Somebody will tell you a story about what's wrong, and they'll tell it in such a way that there's no way the problem can be resolved. Especially around stuff like, relationship problems where, he did this to me and I said that and I wanted this and all I'm asking for. And the person tells you this story in such a way that it's never, ever, ever going to resolve itself. So the principle here is that you have to find a frame of reference for the problem that is actually solvable in a physically actualized way. In other words, that it's realistic and concrete, that something can be done. Just because you got a narrative, just because you got a story, just because somebody feels something, doesn't mean that that's the way things are. What it does mean is that you may have to do some work to figure out another way of talking about this problem so that it can be resolved. Big stuff to look for in the first instance is talking in vague and abstract terms about emotions. I just want to feel settled. I want to feel happy in myself. These kind of like vague ways of talking, rather than saying, I want X to happen. I want this to happen. Second thing with this is that you talk about and figure out what you want to do, have happen, occur, instead of what you've been doing before. So rather than talking about everybody else and what they're doing and what you want them to do differently and the way you want the world to be different, you talk instead about you. What you want to do different, how you want to be different, think different, and act different. The more specific you can get on that, the easier it will be to create a path. Because if you're always talking about what everybody else has to do and the way the universe has to be different, in order for you to be happy or get whatever it is you want, you may end up waiting for a long time. So a quick example of this is the kind of situation where I had a client who told me that they were having trouble making a series of changes that they wanted to make. And they had a lot of knowledge. And they told me about a lot of the things that they'd read and the courses they'd been on and which videos they'd watched and all the rest of that. But they still couldn't change to do this series of things that they wanted to do. And when I asked a bit more about what they wanted to do, everything that they wanted to do was a doable. In other words, there wasn't any particular limitation or things standing in the way if they just went ahead and did them. So on further discussion with this person, what I discovered was that many of these things that they wanted to do in the sequence, or they said they wanted to do, they actually didn't want to do. The problem wasn't that they couldn't do what they wanted to do. The problem was they were forming goals that they thought they should be doing. So in other words, the problem was, instead of figuring out what they actually wanted, they were trying to do stuff that other people had told them is what they should be doing. Yeah? You don't have to have 3 PhDs, one of which is in astrophysics, in order to figure it out, nor does it take a deep psychological analysis in order to know that if you're trying to do stuff that you don't want to do and that isn't really yours, that doesn't really come from you, there may be a few problems lined up. The actual frame was, what do you really want? Where are you going? What will make your life better? And if you don't know, then that's where we have to start. Frameware was that they hadn't figured out what they wanted. And they were just borrowing stuff from other people. I've seen many times before in organizations where policy is set up in such a way that what one division does or what one department does badly affects what another department does, but the way that the kind of rewards and reinforcements are created, it leaves these different divisions or sections at each other's throats. So one time I was asked to have a look at, within this one organization, why sales weren't increasing at the rates that they were, and going in and looking at it, the actual problem that they had was a structural problem within the organization, how they were running the business and how they were organized, and then secondly, how they were remunerating people in each of the sections. The challenge for this organization was that the chief executive was also the founder, and how he had set up the company was how he imagined business should be. So the problem that we had there was we had to find a way to make it possible for him to let go of this previous way of organizing things, which of course was the completely correct way to do things. This is how you run a business and this is how you make money doing it. Whereas in fact, what he had done is he had set up policies that made sure that these two sections were going to be at each other's throats and getting in each other's way. Until that was resolved and until we moved beyond the fact that it was a choice, it was an intentional choice that was made, not to put two divisions at each other's throats, but to organize in such a way that would lead to unexpected consequences. So as a consultant, that's of course the first thing that we had to address to get to what the real cause was and then what the real possibilities are. When you're looking at how people are doing what they're doing, where they think they're going, what they think they're creating, and then looking at what they're actually creating, there's sometimes two different things. But this is why I say the first thing is, what do you want? The second question is, what are you creating right now? And between those two, in the story that they tell, we create a narrative of a problem that can be solved. Discovering and creating solvable frames is a skill. If you want more, you can click the link here and go to over an hour's worth of video that Tom made for you on the meta model and using language.